The wind tasted of rust and distance. It blew a fine red grit across the platform of Pine Glass Station, coating everything in a film of Arizona. Nora Whitfield tasted it on her lips as she pressed the heavy station ledger against her chest. The book was a solid, grounding weight in a world that felt determined to lift off its foundations and scatter into the haze. Beyond the shimmering tracks, the Dragoon Mountains sat like a bruised purple spine against the pale, bleached sky. They were a constant, silent witness to the comings and goings of the steam engine, to the dust and to the loneliness that settled in the quiet moments between whistles. The train had just departed, its chuffing fading into the vast emptiness, leaving behind a silence that was heavier than the noise it replaced. Nora's job was a temporary one, a favor for her ailing uncle, who had kept this post for 30 years. She logged arrivals, stamped departures, and kept the accounts in order. It was a world of numbers and schedules, a predictable rhythm that she clung to. But out here, the rhythm of the land was older and more powerful. It was in the slow crawl of a Gila monster across a sun-baked rock, in the patient circling of a hawk, and in the relentless wind that never ceased its whispering. A horse's steady hoof falls broke the quiet. They were unhurried, measured, the sound of a rider who knew his destination and was in no rush to meet it. A man on a buckskin gelding pulled up near the small station office. He didn't dismount immediately, letting the horse blow and settle. He was tall in the saddle, broad-shouldered, wearing a plainsman's flat-brimmed hat that cast his face in deep shadow. When he finally swung a leg over, his boots landed in the red dust with a soft thud. He moved with a kind of weary grace, an economy of motion that spoke of long days and hard labor. He carried a dispatch, a rolled-up paper tied with twine. "For the feed order," he said. His voice was low, rough around the edges like weathered limestone. It was the first time she had heard it up close. He was Eamon Rook, the man from the distant Ember Ranch, a place spoken of in whispers in the nearby town of Willow Trace, a place on the edge of things, bordering Sable Creek, as solitary as its owner. As he stepped onto the shaded porch of the station, he handed her the dispatch. His fingers brushed hers, calloused and warm. Nora kept her eyes on the paper, her training as a bookkeeper demanding her focus. But something made her look up. The light caught his face as he shifted his weight. A faint scar, pale against his tanned skin, traced a line from his cheekbone to the corner of his jaw. It wasn't a jagged, angry mark, but a fine, clean line, like a cartographer's pen stroke on an unexplored map. It hinted at a story, one she felt an immediate, unwelcome urge to read. He had been looking at her. She saw it in the instant before his gaze dropped, shielded again by the brim of his hat. It was a quiet, assessing look, devoid of the usual pleasantries or casual flirtations she sometimes received from passing ranch hands or drummers. His eyes, in that brief moment, were the color of a stormy sky just before the rain, a deep gray that held a depth she couldn't quite fathom. The moment stretched, a few heartbeats where the only sounds were the creak of the station's tin roof expanding in the heat and the distant, lonely cry of a hawk. It was like the sudden, jarring silence when a locomotive applies its brakes, the screech of metal on metal giving way to a profound stillness. She was the immovable track. He was the unstoppable force. And for a second, they had met. Nora broke the quiet, her voice more formal than she intended. "I'll have this filed. The freight agent will see to it on the evening train." She reached for her ink stamp, the familiar weight of the wooden handle a small comfort. She pressed it firmly onto the dispatch, the purple ink blooming on the dry paper. It felt like an act of finality, of closing a door that had been briefly, unexpectedly, pushed ajar. "Much obliged," Eamon Rook said, his voice retaining that same low timbre. He gave a curt nod, turned, and walked back to his horse without another word. She watched him mount, his movements fluid and sure. He guided the buckskin away from the station, becoming a shrinking silhouette against the vast, indifferent landscape, the red dust rising in a small cloud behind him. Nora stood on the porch, the stamped dispatch in her hand, feeling the heat of his brief presence linger in the air long after he was gone. Later, the station buzzed with the low hum of rumor. It traveled faster than the telegraph, carried on the whispers of passengers and crewmen as they waited for the next connection, the Black Snake Gang. The name was spoken with a mixture of fear and morbid excitement. They were ghosts of the Dry Lantern Ridge, striking ranches, rustling cattle, and vanishing back into the canyons. Stories circulated of a rancher found tied to his own fence post, his herd gone, of a supply wagon for the miners overturned and looted, its driver missing. The whispers painted a picture of a shadow spreading across the territory, a darkness that the law seemed powerless to contain. Nora listened as she sorted the mail sacks, the canvas rough against her fingers. The talk made the isolation of Pine Glass Station feel more acute, the silence between trains more menacing. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of the wind through the sagebrush, took on a new, unsettling meaning. That afternoon, Ivy McCrae rode out from Willow Trace. Her laughter arrived before she did, a bright, clear sound that cut through the oppressive heat. Ivy was the owner of the Silver Lantern, the only saloon in Willow Trace that a respectable woman could enter without causing a scandal. She was a whirlwind of energy, with fiery red hair that refused to be tamed by pins and a smile that could disarm the most hardened cowboy. She was Nora's closest, perhaps only, friend in this rugged land. "You look like you're trying to stare a hole through those mountains." "Nora," Ivy said, swinging down from her mare. She fanned her face with her hat. "Come on, I brought lemonade. Doc Finch made a fresh batch with lemons from the last supply train." They sat on the porch steps, the cool, tart liquid a welcome relief. The Silver Lantern was the heart of Willow Trace, the place where news, gossip, and secrets were traded over whiskey and cards. Ivy knew everything about everyone. "Heard the Black Snakes hit the Miller place last night," Ivy said, her voice dropping. "Took half his herd. Miller's convinced they had help from someone on the inside, someone who knew his shipping schedule." Nora shivered, despite the heat. "What does Sheriff Crow say?" Ivy took a long sip of her lemonade, her bright green eyes thoughtful. "Crow says what he always says, that he's investigating, that he has men on it, that the territory has never been safer." She looked directly at Nora. "Listen to me. Dalton Crow is as smooth as a polished river stone, and just as slippery. Don't ever trust him completely. He's got secrets buried deeper than a well." As if summoned by the mention of his name, a rider approached. It was Sheriff Dalton Crow himself. He sat atop a fine black stallion, his silver star glinting in the sun. He was a handsome man, with a politician's easy smile and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. He tipped his hat to the ladies. "Miss Whitfield, Miss McCrae, a pleasant afternoon, though a bit on the warm side." He dismounted, his movements practiced and confident. "Just making my rounds. Wanted to assure you folks out here at the station that we're increasing patrols. Security is better than it has ever been." His voice was smooth, reassuring, the kind of voice that made people want to believe him. As he spoke, his gaze drifted past Nora and Ivy, settling for a moment on the tracks leading away from the station, in the direction Eamon Rook had gone. A flicker of something unreadable passed through his eyes before the charming smile returned. It was a small thing, a momentary slip in a carefully constructed facade. But Nora saw it, and she saw the way Ivy's grip tightened slightly on her glass. "That's good to hear. Sheriff?" Ivy said, her tone perfectly pleasant. "We all sleep better at night knowing you're watching over us." Crow's smile widened. "That's what I'm here for." He gave them another nod, remounted his horse, and rode on toward Willow Trace, an imposing figure of law and order against the wild landscape. "See what I mean?" Ivy murmured once he was out of earshot. "Slippery." The whistle of the approaching evening train cut their conversation short. It was the last train of the day, a clattering, smoke-belching beast bringing mail, supplies, and a handful of weary travelers. Nora helped the mail clerk, a wiry man named Silas, unload the heavy canvas sacks. They thudded onto the platform, releasing a puff of dust. As Silas heaved the last sack onto the trolley, something slipped from an untied corner and fluttered to the wooden planks. It was a single letter. Nora bent to pick it up. It was a plain white envelope, slightly grimy from its journey. There was no stamp, no postmark. It hadn't gone through the official channels. The handwriting was shaky, the ink slightly feathered, as if written by an unsteady hand. It was addressed with a stark simplicity that made a chill run down Nora's spine. To Ear. Below the initials, a short, urgent message was scrawled. Don't go back to Distant Ember tonight. Nora's heart gave a sudden, hard thump against her ribs. Eamon Rook, the man with the scar and the storm-gray eyes. The man who had ridden away from this very spot not 2 hours ago. Heading for the ranch he was now being warned away from. She looked up, her gaze scanning the empty horizon. The sun was beginning to dip, painting the clouds in fiery shades of orange and pink. The wind had picked up again, swirling the red dust around her feet. It was a lonely, desolate landscape, a place where a warning like this could easily mean the difference between life and death. A conflict bloomed inside her, fierce and immediate. Her duty was clear. The letter was unofficial, likely personal. It should be discarded or returned to the mail clerk. It was not her business. She was just the temporary station keeper, a woman of ledgers and ink stamps. Getting involved was foolish, dangerous. But the memory of Eamon Rook's eyes, that brief, unguarded moment of connection, held her fast. She thought of the whispers about the Black Snake Gang, of Ivy's warning about the sheriff, of the faint, unreadable look in Crow's eyes as he had glanced down the tracks. The pieces didn't fit together, but they formed a picture of impending danger. She could ride after him, but she didn't know the trails, and darkness was falling fast. She could give it to the sheriff, but Ivy's words echoed in her mind. Don't ever trust him completely. The letter felt heavy in her hand. A small rectangle of paper containing a world of unseen threats. Nora stood alone on the platform, the train's departing whistle a mournful cry in the twilight. She looked from the letter to the vast, darkening expanse where Distant Ember Ranch lay hidden. What should she do? Give the warning to the solitary rancher, or mind her own business and stay safe? The red dust swirled around her ankles, offering no answers. It settled on her boots, on the letter, on the silent tracks, its fine grit a constant reminder of the harsh, unforgiving land. And in the profound silence of the desert, Nora Whitfield had to make a choice. The decision, once made, settled in Nora's stomach like a stone. She saddled the station's old mare, a placid creature named June, and tucked the letter into the inner pocket of her duster. The trail to Distant Ember was little more than a suggestion etched into the darkening landscape. But the moon, a sliver of bone white against an indigo sky, offered just enough light to guide her. The air grew cooler as she rode, the oppressive heat of the day surrendering to a desert chill that carried the scent of sage and dry earth. Distant Ember Ranch did not announce itself. It simply emerged from the shadows, a collection of low, dark shapes huddled against a low mesa, a modest ranch house, a sturdy-looking barn, and a web of corrals. It was a place built for function, not for comfort, and it seemed to absorb the immense silence surrounding it. As she drew closer, a sound reached her, a dry, hollow clatter. It was a wind chime, but not one of bells or metal tubes. This one was made from the bleached rib bones of a cow, strung together with rawhide. They knocked against each other in the breeze, a stark, lonely music that seemed the perfect anthem for this place. Nora dismounted, her legs stiff from the ride. She tied June to a hitching post and walked to the porch, her boots sounding unnaturally loud on the wooden planks. The house was dark, save for a thin line of yellow light seeping from beneath the door. She hesitated, the letter a burning weight in her pocket. This was a man's private world she was about to intrude upon. A stranger's world. But the words on the envelope pushed her forward. She raised her hand and knocked, the sound swallowed by the vastness of the night. For a long moment, there was no response, only the clatter of the bone chime and the low moan of the wind. She was about to knock again when she heard the soft scrape of a chair and the thud of heavy footsteps. A bolt was drawn back, a sound of metal grinding on metal, and the door opened. Eamon Rook stood in the doorway. A rifle held loosely in one hand, he opened the door only halfway, his body a dark silhouette against the lamplight behind him. He wasn't just blocking the entrance, he was guarding it. The air that drifted out from the house was a mix of scents, both comforting and lonely. The sharp, clean smell of dry pine wood. The rich aroma of well-oiled leather from a saddle she could just see slung over a chair, and the faint, bitter scent of coffee grown cold in its pot. His face was shadowed, but she could see the surprise in his eyes, quickly followed by suspicion. "Miss Whitfield," he said, his voice flat, questioning. "It's a long ride from the station." I had to bring you something," Nora stammered, feeling foolish and out of place. "It fell from the mail sack. It's not official post." She held out the letter. He didn't take it immediately. His gaze remained on her face, searching, as if trying to read the real reason for her journey. Finally. He lowered the rifle slightly and took the envelope. He didn't look at it, his attention still fixed on her. The silence stretched, filled only by the wind, standing there, on the threshold between the vast, dark wilderness and the small, guarded warmth of his home. Nora felt a sudden chill that had nothing to do with the night air. "Close the door," she asked, her voice barely a whisper. It was more of a plea than a question. Eamon seemed to consider it. His gray eyes held hers for a beat longer. Then he gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. "Only if you want," he said, and stepped back, pulling the door wider to let her in. The single room was as functional as the ranch's exterior. It was a kitchen, a sitting room, and likely a bedroom all in one. A stone fireplace dominated one wall, its hearth swept clean. A simple table and 2 chairs stood in the center. A bed, neatly made with a thick wool blanket, was tucked into a corner. It was a space stripped of all but the essentials, the home of a man who didn't expect company and perhaps didn't want it. Nora stepped inside, and he shut the door behind her. The sound of the bolt sliding back into place echoing in the small room. He moved to the table, turning up the wick on the kerosene lamp. In the brighter light, she saw the weariness etched around his eyes. He finally looked down at the letter she had brought. He turned it over in his calloused hands, then slit the envelope open with a penknife from his belt. He read the note in silence. Nora watched his face, but it was an unreadable mask. His jaw tightened, a muscle flexing beneath the faint line of the scar. He read the short message once, then twice. His stillness was more unnerving than any outburst would have been. When he finally looked up, his eyes were like chips of granite. He didn't thank her. He didn't question her. He simply accepted the reality of the threat. "The handwriting," Nora found herself saying. "It looked old, unsteady." "It is," he said, his voice a low rumble. He folded the note and tucked it into his shirt pocket, an action of quiet finality. He walked to the window, peering through a crack in the curtains into the blackness outside. "There's an insider in Willow Trace, someone feeding them information." It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact. Without another word, he picked up the rifle again and gestured for her to follow him to the back door. "Come here, I want to show you something." He led her out into the cold night, around the side of the house to the corrals. The horses shifted and snorted at their approach. The moon cast long, distorted shadows. Eamon knelt by a fence post, holding the lamp low. In the soft, damp earth near the corral gate were hoof prints, but they weren't from his horses. "These aren't mine," he said, his voice grim. "And they're fresh, shod with a notched shoe on the left forefoot. Whoever it was, they were here after I got back, watching." The implication hung in the air. The warning in the letter wasn't about a future threat. It was about a present one. The danger was already here, circling in the dark. A rustle in the sagebrush nearby made Nora jump, and Eamon instinctively moved to stand slightly in front of her. Suddenly, a light bobbed in the distance, coming toward them from a neighboring property. "Eamon," a woman's voice called out. "You there?" A woman emerged into the lamplight, carrying a storm lantern. She was stout, with graying hair pulled back in a severe bun and a face lined with the worries of a hard life. "Maeve," Eamon said, his tone softening slightly. "What is it?" "My lantern's gone dry, and I heard a noise. Just wanted to borrow a bit of oil, if you can spare it," she said, her eyes sharp and assessing. Her gaze fell on Nora, and a flicker of surprise crossed her features. She looked from Nora's face to the mare tied up at the front of the house. She didn't ask any questions, but Nora felt as though she had been weighed and measured in that single glance. Maeve O'Rourke, their neighbor, a widow who ran her small spread with fierce determination. "I can spare some," Eamon said, moving toward the barn. Maeve stepped closer to Nora. "He's a good man, Eamon," she said, her voice low and direct. "Doesn't say much, but he's solid as that mountain." She paused, her eyes scanning the darkness around them. "A word of advice for you tonight. Miss, don't trust the dogs barking. Sometimes they bark at what they're told to, not at what they see." The cryptic warning sent another shiver down Nora's spine, before she could ask what it meant. Eamon returned with a can of oil. Maeve filled her lantern, thanked him with a curt nod, and disappeared back into the night, her own small light a retreating star. Back inside the house, the silence felt even more profound. The warmth of the room was a fragile shield against the vast, threatening darkness outside. Nora's eyes drifted around the space, her senses heightened. She saw things she hadn't noticed before, small details that told a story. On a small mantel over the fireplace, there was a picture frame. The glass was cracked, a spider web of fractures distorting the image within. She could just make out the faded photograph of a young woman with a gentle smile and a small boy, no older than 5, with Eamon's serious eyes. It was a ghost of a family, frozen in a happier time. As she looked at it, Eamon walked over, picked it up, and gently laid it face down on the mantel. He did it without a word, a quiet, deliberate act of hiding a wound. Her gaze then fell on the kitchen area. It was clean, brutally tidy. A few tin plates were stacked neatly. A cast-iron skillet hung from a hook. But something was missing. By the pot of cold coffee on the stove, there was a collection of spoons and forks in a jar, but no ladle. It was a small, insignificant detail, but it spoke volumes. It spoke of meals eaten straight from the pot, of dinners interrupted and forgotten, of the simple domestic tools that a man living alone, a man who had perhaps forgotten how to share a meal, no longer needed. It was the kind of detail that told a story of profound and abiding loneliness. Outside, the windmill began to turn in a rising gust of wind, its blades groaning with a rhythmic, mournful sound, like something in pain. The house creaked around them. Inside, in the charged silence, Nora was acutely aware of the sound of her own breathing, of the steady, cautious beat of her heart, and she had the strange, certain feeling that Eamon Rook, standing by the window and staring out into the star-dusted darkness, was listening to the very same sound inside himself. They were two strangers in a small, lamp-lit room, surrounded by an unknown danger, their hearts beating in the same careful, watchful rhythm. Dawn broke not with a song, but with a silence, an unnatural quiet that pulled Eamon Rook from a light, restless sleep. The familiar, low shuffling and soft blowing of his cattle was gone. The air in the corral was empty. He was on his feet before his mind had fully registered the loss, pulling on his boots, his movements sharp and economical. The cold dread in his gut was an old, familiar enemy. He didn't need to look far. The corral gate was broken. A heavy rail splintered as if by a dozen panicked beasts driven through it at once. The tracks were a chaotic scar in the dirt, heading straight for the lifeblood of his land. Sable Creek. He saddled his horse, his motions tight with a controlled fury. He didn't waste time on anger. Anger was a luxury. Action was survival. At the creek, the evidence was stark and fresh. The muddy banks were churned into a brown soup by the passage of dozens of hooves. And on a small, flat clearing, the ghost of a campfire still breathed. A circle of blackened stones held a bed of embers that glowed a faint, dying orange in the pre-dawn gloom. The air smelled of stale coffee and the greasy scent of cooked bacon. They had been close. They had been confident. By mid-morning, Sheriff Dalton Crow had arrived from Willow Trace with a posse of 6 deputized townsmen. They were shopkeepers and farriers, men more comfortable with ledgers and hammers than with tracking rustlers. Crow surveyed the scene with an air of practiced authority. "They went north," Crow declared, pointing toward a rocky wash that led away from the creek. "The tracks are clearest there. They'll try to lose us in the canyons." Eamon said nothing. He had already seen the trail, the real trail. The rustlers had driven the herd through the creek for a quarter-mile, then exited on the south bank, heading for the broken, difficult terrain of Dry Lantern Ridge. The tracks leading north were a feint, a few horses sent to create a false trail for any fool eager to follow it. A fool like the sheriff. "That's a decoy trail, Sheriff," Eamon said, his voice level, devoid of emotion. They went south, toward the ridge. Crow turned, his charming smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Now, Rook, I appreciate your insight, but I've been chasing thieves in this territory for 10 years. You learn to read the signs. They want us to think they went south. We'll ride north and cut them off at the pass." The other men nodded, their faith in the Silver Star absolute. Eamon looked at Crow, and in that moment, he knew it wasn't incompetence. It was intentional. The sheriff was leading the hunt away from the quarry. He was clearing the path. Eamon watched them ride off, a cloud of dust in the wrong direction, a bitter taste in his mouth. He was on his own. In Pine Glass Station, Nora was trying to impose order on the chaos of the morning freight. She logged crates of tinned goods, sacks of flour, and barrels of nails. The work was a comfort, a world of clean lines and balanced columns. That comfort was shattered when Ivy McCrae burst in, her face flushed and her eyes bright with alarm. "They hit Distant Ember," she said, dispensing with any greeting. "Crow's got a posse out, but they rode north. The whole town's talking about it." She leaned closer, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "That's not all. The freightmaster is in a state. A crate from the last shipment is missing, a heavy one." "What was in it?" Nora asked, her pen hovering over the ledger. "Ammunition," Ivy said. "A whole lot of it, for the mining company up past the ridge." A cold knot formed in Nora's stomach. She flipped back the pages of the ledger, her finger tracing the columns of a meticulous hand her own. There it was. Shipment manifest. Car number 7. She ran the numbers, and then she saw it. A single digit, expertly altered. A 3. Its top loop subtly closed. Its bottom curve extended just so, had been turned into an 8. The change was nearly invisible. A masterpiece of forgery that accounted for the missing weight and rerouted the crate. The numbers balanced perfectly, but they were a lie written in her own book. Later that day, seeking a moment of quiet, she walked into Willow Trace to deliver a telegraph message to Doc Harlan Finch. The doctor's office smelled of carbolic acid, dried herbs, and old paper. He was a kind man with watery blue eyes and hands gnarled by age and the setting of 1,000 broken bones. He saw the worry on Nora's face. "It's about Eamon Rook, isn't it?" he said, polishing a pair of spectacles. Nora nodded. "It seems the whole world is set against him." Doc Finch sighed, a long, weary sound. He gestured for her to sit. "He's had more than his share of that. You know, he wasn't always this way. Wasn't always so quiet and closed off." He paused, looking out his dusty window as if seeing into the past. 3 years ago, the smallpox came through. It moved fast. It took his wife, Eleanor, in a week. And then it took his boy, Samuel. Eamon buried them both himself, right there on the ranch. He's been alone ever since. That ranch isn't just his home. It's a promise he made to them. It's all he has left. The story settled over Nora, heavy as a shroud. The broken picture frame on the mantel, the missing ladle, the guarded look in his eyes. It wasn't just solitude. It was a fortress built around a devastating loss. When Eamon returned to his empty ranch that afternoon, the dust of the false trail still on his clothes, he found the final insult, carved into the top rail of his corral. The very one the thieves had broken was a crude symbol, a snake, coiled and ready to strike, the mark of the Black Snake Gang. It wasn't just a theft. It was a message, a challenge. They were telling him they owned this land, that they could take what they wanted, when they wanted, that he was powerless. He was checking the loads in his rifle when Nora rode up. He heard the horse and turned, his body tense, his face a mask of cold fury. When he saw it was her, the tension didn't leave his shoulders, but his hand relaxed on the rifle. "They're gone," he said, the words clipped. "Crow led the posse on a wild goose chase." "I know," Nora said, swinging down from the mare. "Eamon, they didn't just take your cattle. They took a crate of ammunition from the station. I think they're planning to sell both, and I think they're using the train to move them." He looked at her, his initial surprise giving way to a flicker of interest. She wasn't offering sympathy. She was offering a solution. "They altered my ledger," she continued, her voice gaining confidence. "They knew which car, which manifest. They needed to move the cattle fast, away from the posse Crow conveniently led astray. There's a freight train that passes the old trestle bridge at Dry Lantern Ridge at midnight. It slows on the grade. It would be the perfect place to load cattle and stolen goods onto empty cars." Eamon stared at her. He saw not just the temporary station keeper, but a woman with a mind as sharp and precise as a surveyor's tool. She was connecting the pieces in a way no one else had. She was thinking. He had been so focused on the tracks in the dirt. He hadn't considered the tracks of steel. "We can't tell Crow," he said. It was a statement, not a question. "No," she agreed. "We can't." A silent understanding passed between them. They would do this themselves. They rode out as the sun began its descent, casting long, distorted shadows across the land. They rode side by side, two solitary figures against a vast, indifferent canvas of rock and sage. He set a hard, steady pace, and she kept up without complaint. The wind picked up, a cool breath that whispered through the canyons. It tugged at the simple blue scarf tied around Nora's neck, lifting it from her shoulders until it streamed behind her like a white letter, a message of defiance sent to the empty sky. Night fell quickly, the deep, star-dusted dark of the desert. The temperature dropped, and a chill settled deep in Nora's bones. The mournful howl of a coyote echoed from the ridges, a lonely, wild sound that amplified their isolation. Eamon pulled his horse to a stop. "You're cold," he stated. He shrugged out of his heavy duster, the one that smelled of leather and dust and the faint scent of the man himself. He reached across the space between their horses to hand it to her. As she took it, her cold fingers brushed against the back of his hand. His skin was warm, calloused, and real. A jolt, small but sharp, went through her, It was a simple, accidental touch, over in an instant, but her heart gave a sudden, rebellious lurch, skipping a beat before finding its rhythm again. She pulled the heavy coat around her shoulders, the lingering warmth of him a surprising comfort. "Thank you," she said, her voice softer than she intended. He just nodded, his face unreadable in the moonlight, and urged his horse forward. They rode on in silence for another hour, climbing higher into the rough terrain of the ridge. Eamon finally reined in, holding up a hand for her to stop. He pointed toward a deep ravine ahead. At first, she saw nothing but the blackness. Then she saw it, a single point of light, flickering, disappearing, then reappearing, then another, and another. It was a campfire, its light seen through the branches of distant trees. It blinked on and off, a tiny, malevolent constellation in the deep dark. Like the eyes of a wolf, like wicked fireflies, it was the camp of the Black Snake Gang, and they were riding straight towards it. They returned to the hollow silence of distant Ember Ranch under the cover of a moonless sky. The house, when they entered it, felt less like a home and more like a forward operating post, a small island of lamplight in an ocean of hostile darkness. The air was thick with unspoken questions and the grim reality of their situation. They were two people against a coordinated gang, with the law itself a likely enemy. Nora, still wrapped in Eamon's duster, walked to the hearth. She wasn't a woman accustomed to violence or subterfuge, yet the cold, clear logic of the problem had taken root in her mind. Her world of numbers and schedules had collided with his world of dust and survival, and a new kind of map was required. She found what she was looking for in a small box on the mantel, a few sticks of white chalk, the kind she used for her pupils. She turned to the large, worn kitchen table, its surface of scarred pine, polished smooth by years of solitary meals, became her canvas, with decisive sweeping strokes. She began to draw. A straight, uncompromising line became the railroad track. A small, neat rectangle became Pine Glass Station. A winding, hesitant curve was Sable Creek. She added a cluster of smaller squares for the town of Willow Trace and a series of dotted lines for the known trails. The familiar act of mapping, of bringing order to chaos, centered her. The chalk in her hand felt more natural than a weapon. Eamon watched her, his initial silence one of surprise, then of respect. He had seen this land in terms of landmarks, a particular rock formation, a dead juniper tree, the way the light hit a canyon wall. He had never seen it laid out like this, an abstract problem to be solved. He leaned over the table, the lamplight carving deep shadows on his face, his presence a solid, grounding weight beside her. "Here," he said, his finger touching a spot just south of the creek on her chalk map. "The ground is soft. Quicksand after a rain, a herd would get bogged down." He took a piece of chalk from her, his large, calloused fingers surprisingly deft. He drew a small, cross-hatched circle. "And here," he added, sketching a jagged shape near her line for Dry Lantern Ridge. "Rock slide 2 years back. The trail is narrow. A man on foot could get through, but not a herd. They'll have to go around. Through the low pass by the trestle." His additions gave her abstract drawing a brutal, physical reality. It was no longer just a map. It was a landscape of dangers and opportunities. As they worked, there was a soft knock on the back door. Eamon straightened instantly, his hand moving toward the rifle leaning against the wall. "It's Maeve," a voice called softly from outside. Maeve O'Rourke slipped inside, bringing a gust of cold night air with her. She carried a small bundle wrapped in cloth. Her sharp eyes took in the scene, the two of them leaning over the chalk map, the tension in the room as thick as molasses. She wasted no time on pleasantries. "I put it about that old man Hemlock is selling his yearlings," she said, her voice a low, conspiratorial whisper. "Told anyone who'd listen he's moving them at dawn, heading east. It might pull a few curious eyes in the wrong direction." She then added a new, crucial piece of information. "There's a man who's been asking around the last few weeks, A buyer, name's Laramie. Pays cash for unbranded stock. No questions asked. He's been known to meet sellers out near the old silver claim. That's a day's ride south of the ridge. Eamon drew a new symbol on the table, an L for Laramie, connecting it to their map. The gang's plan was becoming clearer: steal the cattle, load them onto the train at the trestle under cover of darkness, and have their buyer waiting 100 miles down the line. It was efficient. It was audacious. The next piece of the puzzle arrived with the morning sun. In the form of Ivy McCrae. She rode out from town, her horse kicking up a cloud of dust, her expression a mixture of excitement and fear. She had spent the night serving drinks and listening, her ears open for any stray word. 2 men came in late, she reported, her voice hushed as she joined them at the table. Strangers, didn't look like cowboys. They were quiet, but I heard them talking when the piano was playing loud. One of them said to the other, clear as a bell, make sure car number 4 is unlocked. Friday night. Friday? That was tomorrow. Eamon looked at Nora. Her theory had been right. It was all happening, and it was happening fast. The strategic calm of their planning was shattered by the sound of an approaching horse, a fine black stallion. Sheriff Dalton Crowe swung down and strode onto the porch as if he owned it, his smile as bright and false as a lead dollar. Rook, he said, his voice booming with forced cheerfulness. He peered into the house, and Miss Whitfield, an early morning visit. His eyes fell upon the table, upon the detailed chalk map spread across it. He stepped inside without being invited, his gaze sweeping over their work. Well, now, isn't that clever? He said, a slow smile spreading across his lips. A regular war council. He leaned closer, feigning interest. You've got a deft hand. Miss Whitfield, quite the artist. His gaze then lifted from the map and settled on the blue scarf Nora still had tied loosely around her neck. He held the look for just a moment too long. That's a lovely color. It catches the wind so well. The implication was as clear as a gunshot. He knew. He had seen them ride out together. He was telling them he was watching their every move. Eamon's face went cold, his expression hardening into stone. He moved, a subtle shift of his body that placed him between Crowe and Nora. It was a silent, protective gesture, a drawing of a line on the floor as clear as any chalk mark on the table. Just a schoolteacher's doodle. Sheriff, Eamon said, his voice dangerously quiet. Something to pass the time. Crowe's smile tightened. Of course. Well, I just came to say my posse found nothing to the north. The trail went cold. It seems your rustlers have simply vanished. He tipped his hat. You let me know if you hear anything. He walked out, his spurs jingling, leaving a chill in the air that the morning sun couldn't warm. Later, when Nora went to the station to collect her things, Doc Finch was waiting for her. He pressed a folded piece of paper into her hand. His old, kind eyes filled with a deep and genuine fear. This came for you, he said, though Nora knew it had not. The handwriting was the same as the first letter, the shaky, elderly script of a person writing against time. She opened it. The message was even shorter, even starker than the last. If you want to live, don't trust the badge. There was no more room for doubt. They were utterly alone. That evening, they finalized the plan. Their words whispered over the chalk map that now felt like a sacred text. Maeve, your rumor was a good start. Eamon said, tomorrow, spread another one. Say you saw men driving a small herd toward the old mission ruins. It's in the opposite direction of the trestle. It might be enough to keep Crowe occupied if he's of a mind to look busy. Maeve nodded, her face grimly determined. Consider it done. Ivy, we need you at the lantern, he continued. If any of Crowe's men or the strangers come in, keep them there, spill a drink, start a fight, whatever it takes. We need to buy time. I can be very distracting when I want to be, Ivy said with a thin smile. Nora, he said, turning to her, you need to be at the station. You're the only one who can confirm the car number. If they switch it, we need to know. When you're sure, hang a red lantern in the station window. I'll be able to see it from the trestle." "And you?" she asked, her voice quiet. "I'll be waiting for them at the bridge," he said simply. The finality of it. The simple division of labor that ended with him alone, facing a gang of armed men, hung heavy in the room. Nora looked down at her hands. They were good for holding chalk, for stamping ledgers, for turning pages. They felt useless. "I need to know how," she said, looking up at him. "How to shoot." The request surprised him. He studied her face, saw the fear there, but also a bedrock of resolve that he was beginning to recognize. He gave a single, curt nod. He took her out behind the barn as dusk bled across the sky. He pushed a storm lantern onto a fence post 50 feet away and lit the wick, the small flame a fragile beacon in the growing twilight. He handed her his revolver. The weapon was shockingly heavy, a dense, cold weight of steel and wood. It felt alien in her hand. "Stand here," he instructed, his voice low and patient. "Feet apart, lean into it." She tried to mimic his stance, but she felt awkward, unsteady. Her hands trembled. Her ears burned with a mixture of fear and concentration. She raised the gun, trying to align the sight with the distant flame, but her arm shook. "You're fighting it," he said from behind her. He stepped closer, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body. His chest was a solid wall at her back. He reached around her, his right hand covering hers on the grip, his left hand gently steadying her arm. "Don't fight it. Become part of it." His breath was warm on the nape of her neck. The scent of him, leather, dust, and something uniquely his own, filled her senses. The world narrowed to the small space they occupied, the solid feel of his body against hers, the weight of the gun now steady in their shared grip, and the tiny, distant flame of the lantern. "Breathe out slow," he murmured, his voice a low vibration against her back. "Squeeze the trigger. Don't pull it." In that charged, intimate moment, a spark of her old self, the woman who was more than just a frightened participant, flickered to life. She turned her head slightly, her cheek almost brushing his. "Close the door," she teased, her voice a breathy whisper, echoing their first tense meeting on his porch. She felt more than heard, the rumble in his chest, a soft, unused sound, a laugh. It was the first time she had heard it, and it was a revelation. "After you hit the storm lantern," he replied, his voice laced with a gentle challenge. She turned her focus back to the target. She breathed out, the world falling away until only the gun sight and the flame existed. She squeezed the trigger. The explosion was a deafening crack that shattered the evening's peace, followed by the high-pitched whine of the bullet. The lantern on the post didn't jump or shatter. It simply went dark. The wick, severed by the shot, was extinguished. A plume of smoke rose from the muzzle of the gun, smelling of sulfur and finality. In the sudden, ringing silence, Nora lowered the revolver, her arm tingling from the recoil. She turned to look at him. A slow, audacious smile spread across her face, a smile of pure, unadulterated triumph. And Eamon Rook looked back at her, at the woman standing in the twilight with a smoking gun in her hand and a victorious smile on her lips. He looked at her as if he had been living through a long, relentless drought, and he was seeing, for the very first time, the promise of a sunrise. Thursday night transformed the Silver Lantern. On most nights it was a simple saloon, a place for dusty men to wash down the trail with rye whiskey. But tonight, it was a different creature altogether. Lanterns, dozens of them, were hung from the rafters, their wicks trimmed low to cast a warm, honeyed glow that softened the room's hard edges. The light pooled on the polished bar, gleamed on the strings of a fiddle, and painted the faces of the crowd in shades of gold and shadow. The air was thick with the scent of sawdust, spilled beer, cheap perfume, and the low hum of 100 conversations. It was crowded, deliberately so. Ivy had put the word out the fiddler from Tucson was passing through. At Ivy's quiet instruction, the small band of fiddle, a guitar, and a slightly out-of-tune piano avoided their usual boisterous reels and breakdowns. Instead, they played a series of slow, mournful waltzes. The music was a languid river flowing through the crowded room, its tempo just slow enough to make the spaces between the notes feel significant, just slow enough for a careful listener to pick a single voice out of the general din. Nora and Eamon entered not as co-conspirators, but as a new couple, still slightly tentative in each other's presence. Nora wore a simple calico dress, the one she saved for Sundays, its dark blue color making her stand out less as a station keeper and more as a woman enjoying an evening in town. Eamon looked profoundly out of place, yet steadfastly present. He had scrubbed the trail from his skin and wore a clean, dark shirt, but the wildness of his ranch still clung to him in the way he stood, his shoulders a little too broad for the crowded room, his eyes constantly moving, assessing every entrance and exit. They didn't speak. They let the story be told by the way he placed a hand on the small of her back to guide her through the press of bodies, the way she looked up at him with a feigned shyness that didn't feel entirely feigned. He bought them 2 glasses of sarsaparilla, and they stood near the wall, watching the dancers turn on the floor. "It's time," he said, his voice a low murmur that was swallowed by the music. She nodded, her heart beginning a slow, heavy drumbeat against her ribs. He held out his hand. "May I have this dance, Miss Whitfield?" he asked, the formal words a strange and thrilling contrast to the grim purpose behind them. She placed her hand in his. His palm was rough, a landscape of calluses and hard work, but his grip was surprisingly gentle. He led her onto the small, crowded dance floor. The floorboards creaked and groaned under the scuff of dozens of boots, a percussive accompaniment to the fiddler's sad melody. He put his hand on her waist, and she rested her other hand on his shoulder. They were closer now than they had been even when he had stood behind her in the dark, teaching her to shoot. Their first few steps were clumsy. He was a man more accustomed to the rhythm of a horse's gait than a waltz. She was a woman more familiar with the precise lines of a ledger than the fluid lines of a dance. But then, they found it, a shared rhythm, a silent agreement. They began to move as one, turning slowly in the warm, golden light. Under the cover of the music, shielded by the bodies of the other dancers, they began to speak. Their words were not the sweet nothings of lovers, but the cold, hard mechanics of a desperate plan. They whispered their strategy as if it were a secret, forbidden confession. "The red lantern is clean and ready," she breathed, her lips near his ear. The scent of pine and clean cotton rose from his shirt. "I'll light it in the east window the moment I'm certain." "I'll be in the rocks above the trestle," he murmured back, his gaze sweeping the room over her shoulder. "I'll see it from there. The train slows on that grade. They'll have maybe 10 minutes to load the cattle." His breath stirred the hair at her temple, and an involuntary shiver traced its way down her spine. They turned, their steps now sure and synchronized. Her hand tightened on his shoulder. "Be careful. Eamon, they'll be armed. They'll be expecting trouble." The warning felt inadequate, a ridiculously small sentiment for the danger he was facing. "I am not a man who looks for trouble." "Nora," he said, his voice a low vibration she felt through his chest. "But I have learned how to face it when it comes." In that moment, with the sad music swirling around them and a deadly plan passing between them, the pretense began to melt away. The careful distance they had maintained was eroded by their proximity, by the shared danger, by the simple, profound act of moving together in time. Her awareness of him was acute, the solid strength of his shoulder beneath her hand, the steadying presence of his hand at her waist, the way his stormy gray eyes seemed to find hers in the dim light. They were no longer just acting. They were a man and a woman, holding on to each other on the edge of a precipice. The waltz ended. the final note of the fiddle hanging in the air like a question. Before they could step apart, a smooth voice cut through the applause. "A lovely sight." Sheriff Dalton Crowe stood before them, his smile polished, his silver star gleaming in the lantern light. He ignored Eamon completely, his eyes fixed on Nora. "Miss Whitfield, you are as graceful on your feet as you are with your bookkeeping," he said, his charm as thick and suffocating as smoke. "Perhaps you would honor me with the next dance." It was not a request. It was a command wrapped in courtesy. Nora felt a knot of ice form in her stomach. To refuse would be to raise suspicion. She looked at Eamon, a silent question in her eyes. Eamon's expression didn't change. He remained perfectly still. But Nora could feel the tension that coiled through him, a powerful stillness that was more menacing than any outward show of anger. His eyes, fixed on Crowe, were calm, but it was the unnatural calm of a tightly wound spring. He gave a slow, deliberate nod. "Of course, Sheriff," Eamon said, his voice flat. He released Nora's hand and stepped back, melting into the crowd at the edge of the dance floor. He did not take his eyes off them. Crowe took Nora's hand. His grip was firm, possessive, his palm smooth and dry. He led her into the first steps of the new waltz, his movements expert and confident. "Rook is not much of a dancer," Crowe said, his voice a low, conversational purr. "He is a man of the earth, hard, silent, not one for such refined company." "He is a good man, Sheriff," Nora said, her voice steady despite the frantic beating of her heart. "Good men often meet bad ends in this territory, Miss Whitfield." Crowe replied smoothly, "It is a dangerous place for those who stand alone." He spun her in a slow, deliberate turn. As he did, his unbuttoned coat flared open for a brief second, and in that second, Nora saw it, pinned to the inside lining of his waistcoat, almost hidden in the dark fabric, was a small, crudely embroidered patch. It was a simple, ugly thing, stitched with thick black thread. It was a snake, coiled in a circle, its head raised to strike. The sight hit her with the force of a physical blow. Her blood ran cold. It was real, all of it. The sheriff, the symbol of the law in Willow Trace, wore the mark of the Black Snake Gang against his heart. Her step faltered for a fraction of a second, a tiny misstep that he probably didn't even notice. She recovered instantly, but her mind was reeling. From the edge of the room, Eamon saw the flicker of shock on her face, the momentary widening of her eyes. He didn't know what she had seen, but he knew it was something terrible. He also saw the two men standing near the saloon's bat-wing doors, the strangers Ivy had mentioned. They weren't drinking or talking. They were watching Crowe, watching Nora. They were lookouts. Eamon moved. He didn't rush. He ambled over to the bar, ordered another sarsaparilla he didn't want, and then, instead of returning to his spot, he leaned against a post directly between the lookouts and the dance floor. He was a broad, solid obstruction. He sipped his drink slowly. His body relaxed, but his position now blocked the watcher's clear view of the sheriff and his dance partner. At the bar, Ivy saw the entire silent drama unfold. Nora's frozen expression, Eamon's subtle shift in position. She knew it was time. With a theatrical gasp, she let the heavy wooden tray she was carrying slip from her grasp. A dozen empty whiskey glasses crashed to the floor, the sound an explosive shatter of glass and noise that cut through the music and the conversation. The entire saloon flinched. The music screeched to a halt. Everyone turned to look at the mess. In that single, chaotic moment of universal distraction, Maeve O'Rourke, who had been sitting quietly at a small table, moved. She shuffled past Nora, who was now standing stock still as Crowe turned to glare at the commotion. Maeve stumbled, bumping into Nora's side as if she'd been jostled by the crowd. "Pardon me, dear," she grumbled, and then she was gone, lost in the throng, but in Nora's hand, there was now a small, tightly folded piece of paper. Crow turned back to her, his charming facade cracking with irritation. "Clumsy help," he muttered. But the moment was broken. The dance was over. "I believe I'm feeling a bit faint, Sheriff," Nora said, pressing a hand to her forehead. "The heat." It was the perfect excuse. Eamon was at her side instantly. "I'll see her home," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. He took her arm, and they moved through the still buzzing crowd toward the door, leaving Crow standing alone in the middle of the dance floor. Outside, the night air was a shock of cold, clean relief after the heat and noise of the saloon. The wind swept down the empty street, pushing the saloon's swinging doors back and forth with a rhythmic, rattling creak. Nora leaned against the porch railing, her legs unsteady. She opened her hand and unfolded the crumpled note. In the faint light spilling from the saloon window, she read Maeve's hurried pencil scrawl. Car 4 changed to 3. They were adapting. They were moving the target. This small piece of information had just saved the entire plan from failure. She looked up at Eamon, his face a grim silhouette against the starry sky. He had been right about everything. He looked at the rattling doors, then back at her. The noise was a restless, urgent sound in the quiet of the night. "Close the door," he asked, his voice low, the words carrying the weight of everything that had happened and everything that was about to. Nora shook her head, the wind catching a loose strand of her hair and whipping it across her face. She looked out into the darkness that surrounded Willow Trace, the darkness where the trestle bridge and the train and the Black Snake Gang were all waiting. "Not yet," she said, her voice clear and strong. "Tonight, we need the wind to cover our tracks." The night air at Pine Glass Station was cold and sharp, each breath a small, crystalline pain in Nora's lungs. The silence was absolute, a heavy blanket that smothered the landscape. She stood on the platform, a solitary, unmoving figure. In her hand, she held the unlit storm lantern, its glass cold to the touch, its brass body reflecting the distant, indifferent light of the stars. She was no longer a bookkeeper or a temporary school teacher. She was a linchpin, a single, fragile point on a living map, and the world was about to converge on her position. Far away, a sound began. It was not a sound so much as a vibration. A tremor felt through the soles of her boots, traveling up through the wooden planks of the platform. It was the whisper of the coming train. The whisper grew into a low rumble, and then a single, mournful shriek of a whistle split the night, echoing off the dark faces of the Dragoon Mountains. The train was coming. The clock had started. Miles away, nestled in a jumble of granite boulders overlooking the trestle bridge, Eamon Rook was as still as the rock he leaned against. He had become part of the landscape, a shadow within shadows. The cold of the stone seeped through his duster, but he didn't feel it. His senses were stretched taut, focused on 2 points of light in the vast darkness. The first was the approaching cyclopean eye of the locomotive, growing steadily brighter as it snaked its way through the canyons. The second was a tiny, distant spark of yellow, the light in the window of Pine Glass Station, where Nora waited. His rifle lay across his lap, its wooden stock and steel barrel cool and familiar in his hands. He was a patient man, a man who knew how to wait for the precise moment to act. The train hit the grade leading to the bridge, and its rhythm changed. The chuffing of the steam engine became a labored, percussive roar. The clatter of the wheels slowed, each turn a deliberate, groaning complaint of steel on steel. Hissing steam billowed into the cold air, momentarily obscuring the moon. It was a monstrous, breathing beast, and it was moving into their trap. Nora watched it approach, her heart hammering against her ribs in time with the engine's straining pistons. Car after car rumbled past, dark shapes full of unknown cargo. She counted 1, 2, 3. Shadows detached themselves from the deeper darkness near a railway shed. 4 men, They moved with a low, predatory crouch, their boots making soft, urgent thuds on the gravel bed. As car number 3 drew level with them, they moved. One of them threw a grappling hook, its claws catching the edge of the open-top car with a sharp, metallic clank. With a fluid, practiced motion, they swarmed up the side, dark figures against the fleeting light from the engine's firebox. The last man to go up heaved a heavy, canvas-wrapped parcel over the side, a parcel marked with a telltale smear of dark, sticky pine resin. The ammunition. Eamon saw it too. From his vantage point, he watched the men board the car. The number 3. Maeve's information had been correct. Now, he waited for Nora's signal. The confirmation. He shifted his weight, the rifle now a heavy, solid promise in his hands. Back at the station, Nora reached for the matches in her pocket, her fingers numb with cold and fear. This was it. It was time. As her hand closed around the small wooden box, a voice spoke from the shadows right beside her, so close it was almost a whisper in her ear. "It's a long night, schoolteacher." Nora froze, a gasp catching in her throat. Sheriff Dalton Crowe stepped out from the deep shadow of the station's overhang. He hadn't made a sound. He had been there all along, watching. His smile was a predatory slash in the dim light. "Waiting for someone?" he asked, his voice dripping with a false, dangerous charm. Nora's mind raced, a frantic search for an escape, for a plausible lie, her plan, her signal. Everything was about to collapse. She had to stall him. She had to keep him talking. She fell back on the only world where she was the authority. "Sheriff," she said, her voice shaking only slightly. "I was just rechecking the manifest. There's a discrepancy in the ammunition ledger I was hoping to correct before the freight master takes over in the morning. A clerical error." Crowe's smile widened, but it held no warmth. It was the smirk of a man who had already won the game. He knew she was lying. He took a slow step closer. "Clerical errors," he mused, his voice soft. "It's amazing how a small slip of the pen can make a whole crate of rifle cartridges simply disappear." He let the words hang in the air. His right hand, which had been resting casually on his hip, now dropped, his thumb hooking over the worn leather grip of the pistol holstered there. "I think you and I should have a long talk about your bookkeeping, Miss Whitfield, after the train has passed." The threat was naked, undisguised. He was going to let the heist happen, and then he was going to deal with her. Suddenly, in the distance, a new light bloomed. It wasn't the yellow of a lantern, but a stark, brilliant white. On the tall signal post at the edge of the Willow Trace town limits, a white cloth, a bartender's apron. Ivy's apron had been hung over the signal lamp, catching its light and turning it into a beacon. It was a desperate, improvised signal. It wasn't the one they had planned, but its message was the same. "He's not in town, he's with you, the trap is sprung." Eamon saw it. His eyes, trained on the station, caught the sudden change. It wasn't the red signal he was expecting, but it was a signal nonetheless. And it meant Nora was in trouble. He didn't hesitate. He raised his rifle, not aiming at a man, but at the heavy wooden beam at the front of the trestle. He squeezed the trigger. The crack of the rifle shot was a whip crack that tore through the night, louder than the train's roar. A chunk of wood the size of a man's fist exploded from the trestle beam, a spray of splinters in the moonlight. The effect was instantaneous. Chaos erupted. The horses, tied to the far end of the bridge and already spooked by the train, screamed in terror. One of them reared, its eyes white, and snapped its reins. The rustlers in the open car, caught completely by surprise, yelled in alarm. Their carefully laid plan had just been shattered. The entire trestle bridge seemed to groan under the sudden shockwave, the old wood shuddering. Down at the station, Crowe's head snapped toward the sound of the shot. The charming facade vanished, replaced by a mask of pure, undiluted fury. He knew. His trap had been discovered. "You clever little—" he snarled, and in one swift, brutal motion, he grabbed Nora. He spun her around, his arm a steel band around her waist, and pressed the cold, round muzzle of his pistol hard into her side. "Not another move," he bellowed into the night, his voice directed at the unseen shooter, "or the schoolteacher gets a lesson she won't walk away from." He began to drag her along the platform, using her as a shield. Her mind, which had been frozen in terror, suddenly flashed with an image of the heavy ink stamp on the counter inside the station office, its pad still wet with dark purple ink. It was a desperate, insane idea. "My satchel," she gasped, feigning a stumble. "Inside, my records." For a fraction of a second, he was distracted, his grip loosening as he tried to pull her upright. It was all the time she needed. She twisted, not away from him, but toward the open office door. She lunged, her hand closing not around a satchel, but around the heavy, ink-soaked stamp pad. Without thinking, she spun back and flung it with all her might into his face. The wet felt pad hit him with a sickening slap. Dark, viscous stamping ink splattered across his eyes, his nose, his mouth. He gave a strangled, furious roar of pain and surprise, his head jarrawing back as the caustic liquid burned his eyes. For a critical moment, he was blind. His grip on Nora loosened, his other hand flying to his face to claw at the blinding ink. At that same moment, Eamon, seeing Crow grab Nora, had broken cover. He wasn't running from rock to rock. He was charging, a desperate, headlong sprint down the rocky incline toward the train. He ignored the shouts of the rustlers, ignored the risk of a stray bullet. He had only one goal. He hit the gravel embankment at full speed, his long legs eating up the ground. He launched himself at the moving train, not at the car full of rustlers, but at the small caboose at the very end. His fingers caught the iron railing, and with a surge of adrenaline, he hauled himself aboard the rocking car. He didn't pause. He slammed the caboose door open and lunged for the emergency brake lever on the wall. It was a heavy, cast-iron bar, stiff from disuse. He grabbed it with both hands, planting his feet, and threw his entire weight against it. There was a deafening screech of protesting metal. The brake shoes slammed against the train's wheels, and a shower of brilliant orange sparks erupted from beneath every car. A sudden, violent meteor shower that lit up the night. The train shuddered, its momentum fighting against the sudden, immense friction. Sparks rained down onto the dry wood of the trestle bridge like falling stars. And in the heart of the chaos, the great iron beast began to grind to a halt. The world erupted into a cacophony of panicked shouts, splintering wood, and the terrified screaming of horses. The Black Snake Gang, their perfect plans shattered, scrambled from the stalled train car like rats from a flooding cellar. They abandoned the cattle, abandoned the ammunition. Their only thought now was escape. They fled into the familiar, jagged darkness of Dry Lantern Ridge, a landscape that had always been their sanctuary. But tonight, it was a trap. From the south, Eamon Rook pursued them, a relentless shadow moving with the quiet lethality of a mountain lion. And from the north, cutting off their retreat toward Willow Trace, Nora rode, no longer the station keeper but a determined outrider, her path lit by a single, bouncing lantern. That lantern was a promise. Before she had left the chaos of the station, Doc Finch had pressed it into her hands. It was an old, heavy storm lantern, its glass clean, its brass polished. "There are some truths you can only see in the dark, Nora," the old doctor had said, his voice grave. "This might help you find them." The words had felt less like advice and more like an oath. Now, its steady golden flame was a small, defiant star against the overwhelming blackness of the ridge. The chase ended in a natural amphitheater of rock, a dead-end canyon where the sheer granite walls rose up on three sides like teeth. The gang was cornered, but they were not without a final, desperate card to play. As Nora and Eamon closed in from opposite ends of the narrow canyon entrance, a figure was dragged from the shadows. It was Maeve O'Rourke, her face pale with terror. A rough hand clamped over her mouth, Sheriff Dalton Crowe stood behind her, his face a grotesque mask of dried ink and fury. He had captured Maeve as she had tried to circle back and warn them. He held the barrel of his pistol pressed against her temple. "That's far enough." "Rook," Crowe's voice echoed off the canyon walls, raw and unhinged. The last vestiges of his charming facade had been burned away, leaving only the ugly truth. "This is my town, my territory. The law is a trumpet, and it only plays the tune of the man with the strongest lungs. Tonight, that's me." Eamon froze, his rifle half raised. Nora reined in her horse, her heart seizing in her chest. The gang members, emboldened by their leader's desperate move, raised their own weapons, their faces grim in the moonlight. The standoff was absolute, a tableau of light and shadow. The pale, cold moonlight illuminated the scene from above, while the flickering lamplight from Nora's horse cast long, dancing shadows that made the gunmen look like monstrous phantoms. Slowly, deliberately, Nora dismounted. She held the storm lantern Doc Finch had given her, its warm light feeling both impossibly fragile and immensely powerful. With every eye in the canyon fixed on her, she walked to the very center of the narrow pass, the space between the two armed factions. She knelt and placed the lantern on the ground, on a flat, gray stone. The effect was immediate and profound. The lantern's golden circle of light created a line, a border as clear and absolute as a freshly drawn map. On one side, bathed in the warm, living light, stood Nora. On the other, lurking in the stark, cold moonlight and the deep shadows it created, were Crowe and his men, with Maeve held captive in their midst. It was a line drawn not in the dust, but in the very fabric of the night. A line between justice and corruption, between hope and despair. Eamon watched her, his heart a tight, aching knot in his chest. He saw the line she had drawn, and then he looked at Maeve, at her terrified eyes, at the gun pressed to her head. He saw not just his neighbor, not just a brave widow caught in the crossfire. He saw a ghost. He saw the face of his wife, Eleanor, her life slipping away in a fevered haze. He saw the face of his son, Samuel, small and helpless against a force he could not fight. He had lost them. He had failed to protect them. The memory was a raw, unhealed wound, and the sight of Maeve in peril tore it wide open. He could not bear to watch another person he cared for be swallowed by the darkness while he stood by, armed but helpless, with a slow, deliberate movement that seemed to cost him everything. Eamon Rook lowered his rifle. He placed it on the ground and pushed it away with the toe of his boot. He raised his empty hands, his palms open. "Let her go, Crowe," he said, his voice rough with an emotion Nora had never heard before. "It's me you want." He took a step forward, crossing from the shadows into the lantern's golden circle of light. He was offering himself, trading his life for Maeve's. Nora gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. In that single, selfless act, she understood the full depth of his pain, the terrible weight of the ghosts he carried. He wasn't just trying to save Maeve. He was trying to save himself from the agony of losing someone again. Crowe laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You always were a fool. Rook, a noble, predictable fool." He shoved Maeve toward her friends, and she scrambled away, collapsing near Nora. "The woman is nothing to me, but you're a loose end. And I want the ledger, the station ledger." He gestured with his pistol toward Nora. "Give it to me. It'll prove the ammunition shipment was logged correctly. A simple clerical error that you, in your grief, Miss Whitfield, tragically misunderstood." He was going to use her own meticulous work to bury his crimes forever. All eyes turned to Nora. The ledger was her shield, her truth. It was the only real proof they had. To give it up was to lose everything. She clutched the heavy book to her chest, her mind racing. She looked at Eamon, standing alone and unarmed in the circle of light, a willing sacrifice. She looked at Crowe, his face a mask of triumphant evil. She bit her lip, her expression one of agonizing indecision. Then, with a small, choked cry that sounded like a sob of defeat, she did the unthinkable. She opened the ledger. Her fingers trembled as she found a page in the middle. With a sharp, tearing sound that echoed in the silent canyon, she ripped the page from its binding. Crow's smile was predatory. A wise choice. But Nora didn't hand him the page. Instead, she held it up. And then, with a second, even more violent tear, she ripped the page in half. Then she reached down to the hem of her sturdy riding skirt. Her fingers found a thick, nearly invisible seam. With a final, determined wrench, she tore the fabric from a hidden pocket sewn into the very lining of her dress. She pulled out a second set of pages. They were crisp, clean, and covered in her own neat, precise handwriting. A perfect, duplicate copy of the doctored manifest and the true shipping logs. "You think I would only keep one copy, Sheriff?" she asked, her voice ringing with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "You think a bookkeeper's only defense is the original?" Crow's face contorted in a snarl of pure rage. He had been tricked, humiliated. He raised his pistol, no longer aiming at Eamon, but at the incriminating pages in Nora's hand. A single gunshot exploded, deafening in the enclosed space. It wasn't Crow's. One of his men, unnerved and trigger-happy, had fired. Eamon cried out, a sharp, guttural sound, and staggered back, clutching his shoulder. A dark stain bloomed on the fabric of his duster. The sight of him, wounded and vulnerable, broke something in Nora. The fear vanished, replaced by a cold, clear fury. She didn't scream, she didn't run. She drew the revolver Eamon had taught her to use, the one she had tucked into her waistband. She raised it, not with the trembling uncertainty of their first lesson, but with a steady, resolute calm. She didn't aim for Crow. She didn't aim for any of the men. She aimed for the heart of the light. She fired. The bullet struck the storm lantern. The glass chimney shattered with a sharp pop, and the flame, the single point of truth in the canyon, was instantly extinguished. Darkness, absolute and immediate, fell like a guillotine. The world vanished, plunging them all into a blind, disorienting void. The only light was the faint, cold starlight high above, which was not enough to see by. Panic erupted. Men shouted, their voices directionless in the blackness. Someone stumbled, cursing. It was a world without landmarks, a world of pure sound and terror. "In the heart of the chaos," Nora called out, her voice cutting through the noise. "Eamon!" She heard a groan from somewhere to her left. His voice, when it came, was a raw, strained whisper, thick with pain. "Nora, stay back! Don't come near me!" He was telling her to save herself, to run while she could. She ignored him. She dropped the now useless gun and lunged forward, her hands outstretched, stumbling into the suffocating darkness. She was no longer fighting them. She was fighting the night itself. "Eamon, where are you?" She took another step, her foot hitting something soft. A body. She knelt, her hands frantically searching. She felt the rough fabric of his duster, the warmth of his blood. She found his arm, then his hand. It was limp, but it was there. She grasped it, her fingers lacing through his, her small hand enveloping his larger one. His fingers tightened around hers, a weak but definite response. That simple, desperate grip in the pitch-black canyon was more eloquent than any words. It was a lifeline, a promise. It was a single, unbreakable thread leading them out of the heart of the night. Dawn did not arrive with a crash, but with a quiet, inexorable spill of light. It came first to the high peaks of the dragoons, turning them from bruised purple to soft rose. Then it poured down into the canyons and washed over the dusty street of Willow Trace. It was a gentle, honey-colored light that seemed to promise cleansing and renewal. It touched the tin roofs, making them gleam like gold, and it illuminated the scene in front of the sheriff's office with the clarity of a final judgment. Dalton Crow and the remnants of his gang were tied to the hitching rail. They were not defiant. They were broken men, their faces slack with exhaustion and the bitter taste of defeat. Crow's face was a terrible, mocking spectacle. The purple stamping ink, smeared and dried, looked like a permanent self-inflicted bruise, the dark, indelible stain of his own corruption. Justice, it seemed, had a grim sense of humor. The people of Willow Trace gathered slowly at first, drawn by a sense of momentous change. They came from the mercantile, the farrier's shop, and the small, neat houses that lined the street. They stood in a wide, silent circle, their faces a mixture of shock, fear, and a dawning, hesitant relief. The man they had trusted, the symbol of their safety, was a fraud. The world had been turned upside down while they slept. Into that silence, Ivy McCrae's voice rose, clear and steady. She stood on the steps of the Silver Lantern, not as a saloon owner, but as a witness. She told them everything. She spoke of the missing ammunition, a threat to every isolated ranch and traveler. She explained the impossibly balanced numbers in Nora's ledger, the lie hidden in plain sight. She described the switched rail car, a piece of ghost machinery moving through the night. And finally, she held up the small, ugly patch of black thread she'd pulled from Crow's coat after he was subdued. The coiled snake, the mark of the gang he was sworn to destroy, worn like a secret medal against his heart. Her words were simple, factual, and they methodically dismantled a decade of lies. Inside Doc Finch's office, the morning light was softer, filtered through the dusty window pane. The room smelled of antiseptic and fresh linen. Eamon sat on the edge of the examination table, stripped to the waist. The bullet had torn a ragged furrow through the muscle of his shoulder, a deep, angry wound that was more painful than it was dangerous. Doc Finch, his movements slow and practiced, cleaned the wound with a steady hand. "You'll be sore for a month, and you'll have another scar to add to your collection," the doctor said, his voice a low, comforting rumble. "But the bullet passed clean through. You're a lucky man, Eamon." Nora stood beside him, holding a basin of clean water. Her hands, when she had first tried to help, had trembled uncontrollably, the delayed reaction to the night's terror. But now, as she passed Doc Finch a roll of fresh bandages, her movements were precise, her focus absolute. It was the same precision she used when holding a piece of chalk, when making an entry in her ledger. The world of numbers and the world of wounds she was discovering required the same steady hand. She tore a length of bandage, the sound of ripping cloth unnaturally loud in the quiet room. Her fingers brushed against Eamon's uninjured arm, and the warmth of his skin was a grounding, vital shock. He looked at her, his gray eyes dark with pain and something else, something deeper. He had been quiet since they'd brought him in, lost in a place she couldn't reach. She met his gaze, and for a long moment, the rest of the room, the doctor, the morning light, all of it fell away. It was just the two of them, bound by the shared memory of darkness and the silent language of a healing wound. Maeve O'Rourke came in then, her face etched with exhaustion but her eyes clear. She walked directly to Nora, ignoring the two men. She took Nora's hands in her own work-roughened ones and simply held them. "Thank you," Maeve said, her voice thick with emotion. "That's not a big enough word. You put yourself on the scales for me last night. For all of us, I won't ever forget that." She pulled Nora into a fierce, sudden hug. It was the embrace of a survivor, of a woman who understood the true weight of the debt she now owed. Nora, caught by surprise, leaned into the hug, feeling the solid, unyielding strength in the older woman's arms. When Maeve released her, Eamon tried to speak. He cleared his throat, the sound rough and uncertain. "Nora," he began. He wanted to thank her. He wanted to tell her that what she had done in that canyon, the courage she had shown, was beyond anything he had ever witnessed. He wanted to tell her that when she had plunged them into darkness, she had, in fact, created a light that had saved him. But the words were strangers in his mouth. They were heavy, clumsy things, inadequate for the task. His throat felt tight, his tongue like a stone. He gave up on the words. Instead, he reached out and took her hand, the one that wasn't holding the bandages. He simply held it. It was a gesture of profound, unspoken gratitude. His grip was not strong, he was weak from blood loss and exhaustion, but it was possessive. He held on a moment longer than custom or courtesy dictated. It was a silent, desperate acknowledgement, a confession that he had no words for what he felt, and that her presence, the simple touch of her hand in his, was the only thing that made any sense. The rhythmic clatter of the telegraph key from the station office next door broke the spell. A few minutes later, the young clerk burst in, his face flushed with the importance of his news. "A message from Tucson," he announced breathlessly. "They're sending federal marshals on a special train. They'll be here by evening to take custody of Crow and his men. They want all the evidence secured." A collective sigh of relief went through the room. It was over. The responsibility would be lifted from their shoulders. The law, the real law, was coming. Later that afternoon, the town had settled into a state of weary calm. Nora was in the station office, her sanctuary of order. She was putting her world back together, one piece of paper at a time. The original ledger, its spine broken and a page ripped out, sat on the counter like a casualty of war. She was working with the duplicate copy, the one she had carried sewn into her skirt, its pages a testament to her foresight. She opened it, the clean columns and neat handwriting a comforting sight. She reached for the heavy, wooden-handled ink stamp to make an official note. As she picked it up, her hand, still unsteady from the night's events, faltered. The stamp slipped from her grasp. It hit the edge of the counter and clattered to the floor, rolling in a wobbly, uneven circle before coming to a stop directly at the tip of a dusty boot. Eamon stood in the doorway, his arm in a clean white sling. He had been watching her, his expression unreadable. He bent down stiffly, his face tight with pain, and picked up the stamp. He didn't hand it back to her. He just held it, looking at it as if it were a strange and significant artifact. Nora's voice, when she spoke, was barely a whisper, a sound meant only for him in the quiet of the late afternoon. "Last night," she began, her gaze fixed on the stamp in his hand. "On your porch, you said, 'Only if you want.'" She was reminding him of his first words to her, the quiet invitation to step out of the wind and into his guarded world, the question of whether to close a door. Eamon didn't look at her. His gaze lifted from the stamp and drifted past her, out the open doorway of the station. He looked across the dusty street to the Silver Lantern, where Ivy was sweeping the porch. The saloon's bat-wing doors were propped open, revealing the shadowy, quiet interior, a place of sanctuary, a place with an open door. He looked back at her, and, for the first time since the sun had risen, a faint, weary smile touched the corners of his mouth. His gray eyes held hers, and the space between them was filled with a quiet, powerful understanding. "I'm still waiting for you to want to," he said. The rains came in the night, a week after the federal marshals had taken Crow away in irons. It was not the violent, flash-flooding deluge of a summer monsoon, but a soft, persistent whisper that began just after midnight. It was the sound of a long-held breath finally being released. For months, the land had been a study in brown and ochre, the earth cracked and thirsty, the air thick with a fine red dust that coated every surface and settled in the back of the throat. The long drought, both meteorological and spiritual, was over. By morning, the whisper had become a steady, drumming rhythm on the tin roof of the ranch house at Distant Ember. Sable Creek, which had been a mere trickle of brown water over smooth stones, was now a lively, chuckling ribbon of silver, its banks already showing a faint, miraculous blush of green. The world, which had seemed so hard and brittle, was softening at the edges. Tiny, impossibly vibrant blades of new grass pushed their way up around the newly mended fence posts, their color a stark and hopeful contrast to the dark, damp earth. The air itself felt washed clean, stripped of dust and tension, leaving only the rich, loamy scent of life returning. This was the world Nora woke up to. She had been staying at the ranch, a decision made in the quiet, unspoken understanding that followed the chaos. Her temporary post at the station had ended. Her uncle was on the mend, and there was nowhere else she wanted to be. She spent her days helping Eamon, not as a guest, but as a partner. They were rebuilding both the ranch and the quiet spaces inside themselves. Their biggest project was a new grain store, a small, sturdy structure of pine and cedar built to replace the one that had fallen into disrepair. The work was hard. A physical conversation that required few words, the rhythmic rasp of a saw, the solid thud of a hammer driving a nail home, the shared grunt of effort as they lifted a heavy beam into place. These were their sentences, their paragraphs. Nora found a deep satisfaction in the simple, honest labor. Her hands, once soft and accustomed only to paper and ink, grew calloused and capable. One afternoon, a sudden downpour turned the worksite into a sea of red mud. A thick, sticky clay clung to everything. As Nora stepped back to admire a newly set wall, she misjudged her footing and her skirt dipped into a deep puddle. The hem instantly heavy and stained a deep, earthy brown. A small sigh of frustration escaped her. Eamon, who had been securing a roof timber, saw her standing there, looking down at the muddy fabric. He said nothing. He simply climbed down the ladder, walked to the well, and drew a bucket of clean, cold water. He brought it over to her, along with a wooden dipper. He knelt before her in the mud. It was not a gesture of supplication, but of simple, practical care, with a gentleness that seemed at odds with his large, work-roughened hands. He took the muddy hem of her dress and began to rinse it with the clean water, his movements slow and methodical. Nora stood perfectly still, her breath caught in her throat. The sight of this strong, solitary man kneeling at her feet, performing such a tender, humble task, was more intimate than any embrace, more eloquent than any poem. The cold water dripped onto his hands, mingling with the red mud. He didn't seem to notice. He was focused solely on the task, on washing away the stain. When he was finished, he looked up at her, his gray eyes clear and direct. The rain had plastered a lock of dark hair to his forehead. He was still a man of scars and silences. But in that moment, she saw the profound and gentle heart he had guarded so fiercely for so long. That evening, after the rain had softened again to a gentle drizzle, they worked inside. Eamon had spent the day before crafting a new picture frame from a piece of smooth, pale ash wood. The joints were perfect, the surface sanded to a silken finish. He carefully removed the old, faded photograph of his wife and son from its broken frame and fitted it into the new one. He didn't hide it away this time. He placed it back on the center of the mantelpiece, and then he took a single, clean sheet of white stationery and stood it up beside the photograph. The blank page waited, an open-ended question, a space cleared for a future yet to be written. They sat before the fire, the flames casting a warm, dancing light on their faces. The only sounds were the crackle of the logs and the soft, steady drumming of the rain on the roof. The silence was no longer heavy or watchful. It was a comfortable, shared quiet. Her name was Eleanor, Eamon said, his voice low, breaking the stillness. He didn't look at Nora, but at the flames, as if the story were written there. She grew up back east. She hated the dust, but she loved the way the stars looked out here. She said it was like you could see the whole of creation in one glance. He paused, and Nora remained silent, knowing that this was a door he had to open on his own, in his own time. Samuel, our boy. He was only 5. He had his mother's smile. He was a serious little fellow. liked to collect rocks. His pockets were always full of them, weighing him down. A faint, sad smile touched Eamon's lips. I buried them up on the ridge, under the big juniper. It's a good spot. You can see the whole valley from there. He fell silent again. He had given her the facts, the simple, brutal outline of his loss. He did not speak of the pain, of the guilt, of the crushing loneliness that had followed. He didn't have to. It was all there, in the quiet cadence of his voice, in the way his shoulders were set, in the very air around him. Nora didn't offer empty words of comfort. She didn't say she was sorry. Instead, she reached out her hand, not to his, but to his face. She gently laid her palm against his cheek, her fingers tracing the faint, pale line of the scar that ran to his jaw. It was a touch that acknowledged his history, his wounds, both visible and invisible. It was a touch that said, "I see you. I see all of it, and I am still here." He closed his eyes and leaned into her touch, a small, involuntary movement. A man starved for comfort finally allowing himself to be fed. A few days later, when the rain had passed and the sun shone brightly on a transformed, vibrant world, they rode out together. The land smelled clean and new. They shared his buckskin gelding, Nora riding in front of him, her back resting against the solid wall of his chest. The rhythm of the horse was a slow, easy rocking, and the warmth of his body seeped through her dress, a comforting, constant presence. They stopped on a rise overlooking the newly full Sable Creek. The air was so clear they could see for 50 miles. The wind was gentle, carrying the scent of wet sage and new blossoms. Eamon's arms were around her as he held the reins, his hands resting near her waist. He pointed out a hawk circling high above them. As she turned her head to follow his gaze, her cheek brushed against his, the world seemed to stop. They turned to face each other, the small space between them charged with a sudden, powerful current. His gaze dropped from her eyes to her lips. The sound of the wind, the cry of the hawk, the scent of the land had all faded away, leaving only the two of them, suspended in a perfect, silent moment. He leaned in slowly, his eyes dark with an emotion she could finally name. Her own lips parted in anticipation. A loud, wet snort from the horse shattered the spell. The buckskin shook its head, its bridle jingling, impatient to be moving again. The moment was broken, and they both pulled back, a faint flush rising on Nora's cheeks, a wry, self-conscious smile touching Eamon's lips. The world rushed back in, and the unconsummated kiss hung in the air between them, a sweet and lingering promise. Ivy brought them news from town the next day. "Crow's trial is set for next month in Tucson," she announced, her voice filled with grim satisfaction. "With your ledger and Maeve's testimony, they say it's a certainty. He'll be gone for a long, long time." She then sobered. But the rest of the gang, they scattered. They vanished into the territory. The marshals say they'll be back, in one form or another. This land doesn't forget men like that easily. It was a reminder that their peace was a fragile thing, something that would have to be guarded. Their last visitor was Maeve. She came by one evening, carrying a small, heavy object in her hand. She pressed it into Nora's palm. It was an old, black iron key, its surface worn smooth with time. "Every home needs a woman's hand," Maeve said, her voice gruff with emotion. "And this one has chosen you. This door knows your name now, child." It was a blessing, an acceptance, a final, welcome confirmation that this was her place, her home. Later that night, after Maeve had gone, Nora stood before the front door of the ranch house, the iron key feeling both heavy and light in her hand. Eamon stood a few feet behind her, watching, with a hand that trembled only slightly. She inserted the key into the lock. It slid in smoothly. She turned it. There was a soft, satisfying click. It was a small sound, but it resonated deep within her. The sound of a final piece falling into place. The sound of acceptance. She pushed the door open, but she didn't step inside. She stood on the threshold, caught between the cool, star-dusted night and the warm, lamp-lit interior of the home she had helped to save, and which had, in turn, saved her. Eamon came to stand beside her in the doorway. He looked at the open door, at the welcoming light spilling out onto the porch. He looked at her. "Close the door," he asked, his voice quiet, the words now imbued with a history, a journey that had begun with that very same question. Nora turned to him. She was no longer the frightened, uncertain woman who had stood on this porch weeks ago, asking for shelter from a storm she didn't yet understand. She knew her own mind, she knew her own heart, and she knew what she wanted. "Only if you come inside with me," she replied. He came inside with her. The door closed with a soft, final click of the latch. It was a small sound, but in the quiet of the ranch house, it was as definitive as a judge's gavel, as resonant as a church bell. The night wind, which had been whispering at the threshold, was silenced. It could no longer enter, but the scent of the rain, the clean, earthy perfume of a world washed new, had come inside with them. It lingered in the air, a guest that was now part of the home. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a deep, glowing bed of embers that pulsed with a soft, crimson light, like the slow, steady heartbeat of the house itself. Outside, the rain had almost ceased, the steady drumming on the tin roof fading to a gentle, intermittent tapping, a final, soft percussion at the end of a long and tumultuous symphony. The storm had passed. A comfortable, profound quiet settled between them, the kind of silence that is not empty but full, brimming with everything that has been said and everything that no longer needs to be. It was in this quiet that they began the small, domestic rituals of a shared life, their movements tentative, slightly clumsy, like two people learning a new and intricate dance. Nora went to the stove and placed the small tin kettle over the residual heat, the simple act of making tea, a habit from her orderly life at the station, felt different here. It was no longer a solitary ritual to mark the passing hours, but a shared act of comfort, a small offering of warmth. Eamon stood by the fire, his good arm fiddling with a loose button on the cuff of his clean shirt. His large, capable hands, so sure with a rifle or the reins of a horse, were awkward with the small, delicate task. He fumbled with the thread, his brow furrowed in concentration. It was the simple, unguarded gesture of a man relearning the language of a gentle life, a man who had not had a reason to care about a loose button for 3 long years. Nora watched him, a tender smile touching her lips. He was a fortress learning how to be a home again, and she was the one who had been given the key. They sat at the scarred pine table, the same table where she had first drawn the chalk map that had changed everything. 2 mugs of hot, sweet tea steamed between them, their warmth a small defense against the lingering chill of the night. They didn't speak of the future, nor did they dwell on the darkness of the past. Instead, they walked back through the terrain of the last few weeks, revisiting each landmark of their journey not with fear, but with a kind of quiet wonder. "I still have the letter," she said, her voice soft in the firelight. "The first one. I almost didn't bring it." "But you did," he said, his gaze fixed on her face. "Why?" She thought for a moment. "Because of the way you looked at me at the station," she admitted. "For just a second, it was like you weren't seeing the station keeper. You were just seeing me." He nodded, a slow acknowledgement. "I remember the sound of your gunshot in the twilight," he said, his voice a low rumble. "When you hit the lantern, it wasn't just the sound of a gun. It sounded like certainty. It was the surest sound I'd heard in a long time." They spoke of the slow, dangerous waltz in the silver lantern, their whispered plans a secret counter-melody to the sad music of the fiddle. They spoke of the chaotic, beautiful shower of sparks from the train's wheels, a sudden, man-made meteor shower that had lit up the trestle and their desperate hope. They spoke of the whisper on the windy porch, the question that had hung between them, and the feel of the cold night air as they had stood on the edge of it all. They were assembling their history, piece by piece, turning shared danger into a shared foundation. The memories no longer sharp edges of fear, but the worn, smooth stones upon which they could now build. The fire popped, sending a small flurry of sparks up the chimney. The rain had stopped completely now. The only sound was the low moan of the wind, far away, a beast that could no longer touch them. Nora looked up and found him watching her, his expression one of open, unguarded tenderness. The weariness was still there, etched in the lines around his eyes, but it was overshadowed by a light she had never seen in him before, a light that came from deep within. He reached his hand across the table, not to take her hand, but to touch her face. His palm was warm and calloused, a comforting weight against her cheek. She did not flinch. She did not pull away. She leaned into his touch, her eyes closing for a brief moment, savoring the simple, profound comfort of it. His thumb stroked her cheekbone, a slow, gentle caress. "If you want," he began, his voice rough with emotion. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. The two words were a universe. They held the memory of his first invitation on the porch, the challenge of their first shared laugh behind the barn, and the deep, abiding respect he had for her choices, for her will. It was not a question of what he wanted, but a final, quiet affirmation of her own heart. The unfinished sentence was the most complete declaration he could possibly make. She opened her eyes and looked into his, and in their stormy gray depths, she saw the promise of 1,000 sunrises, the comfort of 1,000 nights by the fire, the quiet, steadfast loyalty of a man who had walked through hell and had come back to find his heaven in the most unexpected of places. She did not answer with words. She rose from her chair, and so did he. She closed the small distance between them, and he met her halfway. And in the warm, firelit quiet of the ranch house at Distant Ember, he finally kissed her. It was not a kiss of frantic passion, but of deep, reverent homecoming. It was a kiss that tasted of rain and wood smoke and redemption, a kiss that sealed every promise their journey had made. Later, as he slept, his wounded shoulder finally finding a peaceful rest, Nora stood by the mantel. She looked at the new ash frame, at the faded image of the woman and the boy who had come before her. She felt no jealousy, only a profound sense of continuity, of a story being handed from one keeper to the next. Her gaze fell upon the blank sheet of paper standing beside the frame. It was a clean slate, a new page in the ledger of this ranch, of this life, and she knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her soul, the first entry that would be made, it would be a simple one. Resident Nora Whitfield. Far in the distance, a train's whistle blew, a long, lonely cry that was not lonely at all, but a testament to the world that continued to turn outside their small circle of light. Pineglass Station was still running. Life was still moving forward. In Willow Trace, the coming dawn would bring the final closing of one chapter, the legal, public end of Dalton Crow's reign of darkness. But here, in the quiet heart of Distant Ember, a new chapter had already begun. Its first words written not in ink, but in the steady, synchronized beating of two hearts. The door was closed, but the world had not shrunk. It had expanded. Looking out the window at the vast, star-dusted sky stretching over the newly washed land, Nora knew that the sky within their hearts had widened. Too, it was vast enough, now, to hold everything. All the sharp, sun-baked memories of the desert, and all the soft, healing promises of the rain. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I'd love to see where you're all tuning in from. So please leave a comment below and let's share our thoughts. If you enjoyed this journey, please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like And consider hitting the hype button to help this story reach more listeners.